completely different from that in the western part of North America. Whereas fires in Alaska happen every, say, 50 to 75 years, in Labrador, the fire regime, fire rotation is more like 1,000 years, or even longer. And so this is indicative of the much moister conditions in the eastern part of North America. And the same thing is true, of course, throughout the Northeast, where there is abundant moisture and relatively little role for natural fire. But here what I'd like to do is to kind of broaden the discussion to what's happening in the Northeast in terms of active management in forests to convert them either to young forests or to shrublands and grasslands. And ask the question of why we are actually doing this. Why in the face of natural forest growth, why in the face of an interest in storing carbon in intact and maturing forests, we have on both public and private lands an extensive and well-financed effort to maintain a completely different type of vegetation. The conclusion I'm going to come to is that we're doing this for very good reasons. We're doing it because the vegetation that's created by these activities is unusual, and it supports an unusual array of plants and animals, insects, and other organisms. Also supports a very different array of environments. But I'll point out and try to make the point that this is a suite of conditions, these open land, shrubland, grassland, and young forest conditions, which are completely atypical of the regime that would have dominated the landscape before European settlement, and really are conditions that were created by intensive activities associated with European colonization. So here's two examples: fire and kind of clear cutting, leaving an open savanna of deforested and deep wooded landscape with a few scant, a few additional trees. The fact that this is widespread, I can illustrate just with a couple of slides. Here's a brochure that came out of the Connecticut DEP, which is arguing for clear cutting of forests to create these kinds of open land conditions. And here's an example coming from Mass Fish and Wildlife, or Mass Wildlife, of grants that have been given to mostly private NGOs, a few towns, and private individuals over a 10-year period, more than $2 million of support for private land creation of open lands, shrublands, grasslands, early successional forests. This is, of course, in addition to any public funding and activity that's taking place on public lands. And the graph at the right indicates an ambition by Fish and Wildlife to put something like 20% or more of its holdings into that type of forest category or vegetation condition. Now I argue, and I don't have the time to go into all the data, but I will cite one study that's just come out, a very exhaustive study of 200,000 witness trees, which George referred to in his talk, looking all across the Northeast at the forest conditions at the time of European settlement. I will argue that most of the Northeast was in old forests, operating predominantly under natural processes with very minimal and very localized impact by a thriving native population that was able to live in coexistence with this forested condition. Now, the kinds of conditions that we're talking about are exemplified in particular sites. The very few sites that we have today, like the Pisgah Forest up in southwestern New Hampshire, which is shown on the left in the 1920s. It was impacted by the 1938 hurricane, which blew it down, almost the entire stand, leaving just scattered big trees. And on the right is a picture of what that stand looks like today. Now, Charlie Cogbill in his study provides a quote that's at the bottom of that central photo. Despite the common occurrence of catastrophic disturbances, the return time for fire and wind in the old growth landscape is much greater than the average age of trees in these landscapes. Therefore, small disturbances dominated the disturbance regime and determined the resultant age structure of the region. Largely, we should have an uneven aged or patchy, even-aged forest conditions with the vast majority of trees either in an old condition or undergoing succession towards that condition. As a result of that history and the subsequent European history, the single most uncommon forest condition and habitat type in New England is not early successional or open land vegetation. It is in fact old growth vegetation, forest that is developing into old growth, having been disturbed by natural processes, and the array of natural features like these downed logs and tip-up mounds that occur in forests that are allowed to operate under natural processes. So what happened between the time of Charlie's assessment and today, and how does this help us understand why we are managing for open land conditions? Well, this graph summarizes, doesn't capture fully, the dynamic of what's happened across New England in the last 400 years. Basically, with European arrival, there was a concentrated and incredibly effective and intensive effort to deforest the landscape, convert much of it into agriculture, and then to utilize the rest of the resource as thoroughly as possible. That led to this huge decline in forest cover across New England at the same time as the curve in the bottom left upper right shows, at the same time that the population was actually increasing. So starting in the mid-19th century and into the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century, there's been a remarkable reforestation, largely through natural processes rather than planting of trees, in which forests have come back across all of New England. Now, the important thing to realize with this graph is that in 1850, when Henry Thoreau was walking around Concord, Massachusetts, the few forests that did exist, and then across the rest of the region that were transformed by ongoing logging, were cut over and young. And so all of the right-hand side of this graph shows the recovery of forest cover, and to a certain extent a recovery of forest, intact forest, but all forests that remain young, remain something on the order of 50 to 125 years of age. So we are still, even though we have a lot of forest in the region, and that forest has the potential to grow older, it has a couple of centuries to go before it will really truly be in an old growth condition and undergoing the kinds of full range of natural dynamics that we would have seen before European settlement. So just to give a sense of what that looked like, here on the left, two pictures from Petersham, Massachusetts, one from the late 19th century, one from the modern landscape. You can see how cut over the landscape was, how extensively it was in what is largely a pastured and intensively grazed condition. And this was true of most of New England. Most agriculture was actually grazing. Only about 5% was the planting of crops. And then the remaining woodlots are heavily cut over, small, and many are confined to small patches and fence lines. The forest on the right looks intact. It clearly is a substantial forest cover, but most of that is the first generation of trees. The white pine, for example, all came in on old fields. The hardwoods there are sprouting and regrowing after intensive cutting and also seeding in onto old fields. So still a young and maturing forest that has the potential to store immense amounts of carbon and to become more mature and increasingly more diverse in forest structure. Now, at the same time that this deforestation and reforestation occurred, this tremendous change in habitat, along with focused efforts on extirpation and reintroduction of a few species, led to a complete transformation in the last 400 years and an ongoing transformation in wildlife habitat and wildlife species. And the major dynamic to notice here is, on the left, the decline of large carnivores and many woodland species, and there was a wholesale decline in woodland species as deforestation occurred and forests were heavily cut. And then a thriving of the landscape in the landscape that's described by Henry Thoreau in the mid-19th century of grassland species, shrubland species, early successional species of plants and animals. They're epitomized here by bobolink and meadowlark, but they include a wide range of plants and animals, birds and insects. If you read Thoreau's journals, you'll see what's going on. He's simultaneously lamenting the tremendous loss of wild nature and natural plants and animals. And he's, at the same time, is extolling the beauty and the vibrancy of the landscape that he lives in, which is thriving in butterflies, birds, insects, plants that are really uncommon in the forested landscape. So Thoreau has the ability to embrace both this new, very strongly cultural landscape shaped by European activities of raising animals, at the same time that he laments the loss of wild forest. So on the right, you can see that we're recovering many species. It's actually remarkable. The wildlife that have come back, both through natural processes of just reproduction and growth, migration of old species that were here and new species like coyote that weren't here, and some active reintroduction of species like bear and species like beaver and turkey and some others. So a variety of processes that are going on in this landscape, but there's a general tendency for a tremendous decline in open land species as our forests come back, and for forest species to increase and thrive. So how do we see these kinds of dynamics when we come down to Miles Standish State Forest? Well, interestingly, there was a really early for the kind of work that was being done, study conducted by Bill Patterson and Andy Backman in the 1980s, in which they were charged by DCR, DEM, to come in and examine the history of this landscape and the forest to provide a background for active management. If you look at the pollen diagram here in the upper right, you'll see at the bottom, you'll see oak and white pine. You'll see that there's very, very little pitch pine. Pitch pine is overrepresented because it is wind pollinated. So hickory and beech, which are more insect pollinated or distribute their pollen very poorly, are actually constituents in the forest. At the same time, you see that there's essentially no ragweed, no rumex or sorrel, no grass. So no open lands, no early successional habitat, no weedy kinds of species. The conclusion from Patterson and Backman is that the area was covered by white pine and oak forest with beech and hickory when the Pilgrims arrived in the early 17th century. So amidst white pine and hardwood forest with the diversity of hardwood species. Following colonization, forests were logged and burned, and the land was cleared, leading to a decline in white pine and oak, and a great increase in pitch pine, grass, and weeds. And you can see the associated huge increase in charcoal that occurs after European settlement. And so what we have is the landscape being transformed by European colonization, land clearing, but in this area of Miles Standish especially, heavy logging and intense burning. And that produced a landscape which was atypical for history. It was a landscape dominated by pitch pine and by open areas, more shrubs, more grasses, and more fire. So if we come to that same landscape today, and here's an aerial photo of Charge Pond, where that diagram came from, you'll see that the state has managed the surrounding forest in a very unusual way. Most of the forest has been cleared. What you have are scattered largely pitch pine and a substantially open landscape with little understory and little structure other than the savanna-like structure created by isolated trees. And so in this particular case, the decision has been made to manage in a way not to allow the forest to recover towards what it might have been during pre-settlement times, or not to allow natural processes to operate, which would tend to reduce the early successional species, reduce the grassland areas, reduce pitch pine over long periods of time, but to actively manage to maintain this anthropogenically created, European colonization created landscape of pitch pine, scrub, so-called barrens. So the conclusion from Patterson and Batman's study is really quite telling. The present vegetation of Miles Standish State Forest is quite different from the white pine hardwood forests of pre-colonial times. Land clearing associated with settlement and extensive fires that have burned during the past 2 centuries have produced the pitch pine oak barrens that cover much of the landscape today. And our ongoing management is seeking to retain that vegetation into the future. Now, George is talking about fires, and of course, the other associated argument for clearing this landscape, cutting it very heavily, and burning it is because of the fear of forest fires. Now, we know that all the pollen diagrams, with a couple of exceptions from New England, show a huge increase in charcoal after European settlement. And we therefore know from the pollen work that's been done and from work like Charlie Cogbil's that fire was an unimportant part of the New England landscape before European settlement. But we also know that it became very important with European colonization. And so the question is, what's happened to them since then? What's happened to fires across New England? And one only needs to look at the title of this very intensive kind of data collection effort by Lloyd Erlin, who was a forest economist based in Maine, who was hired by both insurance companies and I think and other groups that were interested in fire to assess the frequency and extent of fire in the historical period across New England, with a focus especially on the last century, the late 19th century into the 21st century. And his conclusion is fires virtually disappeared over a few decades in the mid-20th century, and that's illustrated by these curves here for Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. If we look at Massachusetts and look at the left, the top graph is acres burned, and the bottom graph on the left is the average size of fires. And these are the data collected by Lloyd from which he draws that conclusion. Interestingly, if we look at the number of fires, we see that that doesn't follow in an easily understood fashion at all. We went from having a large area burned in the early 1900s with average large sizes of fires to a very small area in relation and a very small average size of fires. But the number of fires has gone up in the mid to late 20th century and continues to be about as high as it was in the early 1900s. This is one of the reasons that when you hear discussions of fire, and it's important in New England, most of the discussion centers on the number of fires rather than the area burned. The area burned, the actual impact of fire to the landscape is quite small. And it should be noted, these are all set, with very few exceptions, are set by human activity, by carelessness and all. So the reason the fires have decreased is, one, people are more vigilant. There's a lot more people in the landscape with the means to report fires. The agencies involved and fire departments have been very effective at getting the fires and putting them out. People are much more cautious, and we put in a lot of measures to reduce the number of ignitions. And also, the landscape is growing up into older forests and more continuous forests. And forests don't burn anywhere near as well as open grasslands, open shrublands, and open savannas of vegetation. Now, just in case there was a question about the most recent data, I did include the data down here, and you can see that the number has remained low to the present. So an average of, something below 1,500 acres a year that's burning in Massachusetts annually. So I wanted to make the point about fire spread by looking at these two contrasting photos. On the left is an area which has been clear-cut or cleared of trees and then burned and then mowed extensively to create a kind of open hardwood savanna with huckleberry and other ericaceous plants and lots of grasses, little bluestem and other species in there. And this has recently been mowed in the last year, so there's very little fuel out there, very little vegetation other than the trees. That landscape, as it grows up, will become bushy very quickly. It'll have a lot of what are called fine fuels that burn very readily. Because it's open, it gets a lot of sunlight. They will dry very easily, and winds will move through this landscape very quickly. As a result, this will very rapidly, the area on the left, become a real tinderbox for fire and capable of carrying fast, intense fires. So in order to keep it from being that way, we need to manage this and manage it regularly. Every, say, 3 to 5 or 10 years, this area, probably less than 10 years because of the scrub oak that's out there and the huckleberry, to keep the fuel down. So when you create grasslands, when you create shrublands, when you create savannas, you are buying into a management regime in perpetuity in order to keep it in that state and to keep it safe from fire. On the contrast, on the right is the forest here on Martha's Vineyard where I'm sitting, which is slated to be clear-cut and turned into a landscape like that on the left. Now that forest has a high canopy that reduces the moisture at the ground level, it reduces wind speed at the ground level. The fuels in here are discontinuous, so fire would spread, but it would spread slowly. And as this forest gets older and older, at this point it's 100 years or less in age, as it gets older and older, the understory and overstory will become even more separated, and the forest will be even less susceptible of carrying fires that move rapidly or are intensive. So let me include and then show 2 quick additional slides of information. So I think broadly across New England we can say that The landscape was largely covered before European settlement by old and naturally operating forests that were modestly and only locally affected by indigenous activity. There were no upland grasslands, few upland shrublands, and there were early successional forests that were created by the very occasional fire, but most likely by downbursts and other meteorological events like hurricanes and ice damage. Those forests were totally transformed and eliminated by European settlement, and we are now into a process of regrowing continuous forests and older forests that will continue if natural processes are allowed. So the land use practices that are used today to maintain these open land conditions are not trying to maintain something that is native or natural to the landscape. They're trying to maintain a cultural legacy of colonization. They're trying to maintain species which are very uncommon in the landscape, or much more common 50 or 100 years ago, when we were still in the throes of deforestation and the early stages of regrowth of forests. But these are species that are decreasing as the naturally forested conditions expand. So those practices, of course, undermine natural succession, they undermine carbon sequestration and climate mitigation, and they undermine the establishment and thriving of woodland species. So, we can argue about the need to maintain cultural landscapes, and I actually believe that there is a good argument for maintaining cultural landscapes. But I think that we should be able to focus on a need that is overridingly important, and that is to allow a large segment of our landscape to recover back into old forests. Old forests that are not going to be identical to those before European settlement, but that will mimic many of the natural processes, many of the forest structures, and will harbor many of the woodland species that were present 500 years ago. And then finally, and this is where I'd like to conclude, I do think it's important to maintain culturally induced species, especially if they are rare in other species, and I think a strong argument can be made for that. But I don't think you do that through the exorbitant expense and effort and negative environmental impacts of clear-cutting forests, burning them, mowing them, and using heavy equipment to keep them in a historical condition. I think instead what you do is you try to work with those landscapes where those types of habitats need to be created for other reasons. And these would be like power lines, landfills, Air Force bases, the sides of air runways where there are expansive grasslands. And also work with individuals who manage the land actively to keep it in a non-forested condition for a living, and those are farmers. So that takes me a few thousand miles east of us to Europe, where people have been recognizing that their landscape is culturally induced and have been maintaining it for hundreds of years, in some cases thousands of years. Here's a site in Ireland, which was heavily forested thousands of years ago, has been deforested over the subsequent few thousand years, is maintained by sheep, and is maintained in an open, diverse, culturally significant way, maintaining species, views, qualities, aesthetics, and characteristics that are adored by this population. At the same time, there is a huge move across Europe to rewild a lot of these landscapes and to allow them to go into native forests and the way that New England has already done. And then finally, I just refer you to these two articles. The one at the bottom, more recently pulled together by Michael Kellett. The one at the top shows that for at least 25 years, 20 to 25 years, we've been focused very actively on these issues. This particular paper argues very strongly that there's an opportunity to move forward to maintain both European culturally induced landscapes and natural landscapes that are operating freely in New England. But we need to do it by adjusting the actors who are involved in the areas in which we are actively managing. Both of those can be found by going to the Harvard Forest website and searching on the authors involved, and they'll turn up a number of articles along these lines. Thanks very much.